to distill it down for people to understand and relate to it while also hitting the top end science of things. What I'd like to do sometime is show people one of your presentations and break down what about how you're teaching is a good teacher. So Alan is the best teacher I've ever seen, really, and I've seen a lot. Sorry, Jack. Alan's a really good teacher. Yeah, he is. And so that's why I was so excited to see him here for this workshop. With that, before we jump in, I do want to mention after this we have a panel discussion, and then there's a space of time between dinner. And people have started writing what breakout sessions they might want to talk about. So if you are one of those people who may want to do a breakout session, you can write it up here on the board. The first person who did it did the right thing. They said YouTube content creation discussion at 5:30 on the back porch. So now you can't have the back porch if you want the back porch for your discussion. Okay, so just put what it is, location, and then the other one is an aquaponics system overview at the aquaponics system. Second thing that's happening this evening is tell your story in 5 minutes. If you would like to tell your story in 5 minutes, you can tell it in 1 minute, 5 minutes or less. Sign up over here. I'll give you your 3 minutes back, Alan. Anyway, with that, I'm going to hand it off to Alan Booker. You want the handheld?
Operator error. All right, you got me now. There we go. All right, very good. Well, Jack asked me to talk about a couple things, and we was like, Jack, here, what do you want me to talk about? And so I gave him a list, and there was two things. One, tomorrow we'll talk about natural building systems, and today we'll talk about economics and exponential growth. And I'm going to guess that this is a pretty savvy crowd. Because this tends to be what we call a high context crowd. Two, because you've probably been listening to Jack for a while, and he's probably added a lot more economic context to what you already had as pretty good context. But I want to add maybe a couple of things you haven't seen yet and talked about yet. And so I said, well, let me talk about a couple of things I've been looking at with exponential growth and what that's doing and how it explains a lot of stuff. And so I was going to have a really beautiful PowerPoint presentation for you. And then last week I got called off on an adventure for 4 days I didn't expect, but sort of I couldn't refuse. So I was like, I got back and I was looking at this thing and I've been having a conversation with ChatGPT on a professional level course that I'm creating for economics professionals. And this would be like being in the room with people who have, MBAs in finance and PhDs in economic theory and so forth, right? So I'm having this conversation. I was like, well, this is Jack's crowd. Let's actually have something I've never done before, which is we're going to stack a couple of new things in. One is let's have a group conversation. Number two is let me show you how I use ChatGPT. Because I took Jack's course just for fun to see, I've done machine learning since the 1980s, and I hadn't used ChatGPT because I've been really busy. And so it's like, well, if I take Jack's course, it's going to force me to get in there and engage, right? And I want to see how Jack's using this tool because I figured he'd have some pretty savvy business ways of doing it. So, okay, jumped into Jack's course. And of course, what I'm doing is a lot different than the solopreneur thing. And so I went off on different tangents, but a lot of what Jack was doing was really, it's like, oh, that's fun. How can I twist, sort of move that around and get it into my ballpark? So pretty quickly I was like, hi, ChatGPT, here's who I am. I'm I'm an engineer that teaches all these people. I value technical accuracy and balance over everything else, blah, blah, blah. I went through the whole, introduce myself and tell ChatGPT what I wanted. So we've had a lot of back and forth. And so I decided, what what I'm going to do is I recorded part of my conversation with ChatGPT. If you're squinting, you can see this document is 47 pages long. Yeah. ChatGPT once complained at me that I had, quote, high cognitive endurance. Yeah. So this is, but what I thought would be fun would be I put a couple of, I put a couple of pictures up front just to give you a little bit of context. Because I wanted to, when I start this conversation, I need you to know what an exponential growth curve versus a logistic growth curve is. Okay, who's already familiar with that? Okay, so exponential basically runs off, that's the hockey stick to infinity kind of thing, right? We are basically one way of thinking about it is that most exponential functions are what we call a doubling time. How fast does it double? Okay. And then a logistic curve starts off, you see the bottom of the logistic curve up there? Looks like an exponential curve, doesn't it? It is until you hit this middle inflection point. Then what happens? It slows down. Notice what's going on is that this ladder growth, when we go to that little dot there, has growth stopped? No. What's happened? Growth has slowed, right? So in other words, the second derivative has turned negative, which means that whereas the first derivative, growth, okay, is still going, the second derivative, how fast it's growing, is slowed down. So, that's where we are. When we get all the way up to the top and we hit the top point, okay, where's our growth gone to now? 0. And in real systems, what can happen is when you overshoot a carrying capacity, what happens? It goes down. Now we're into negative growth, right? That's that classic overshoot curve where we overshoot the capacity. When you overshoot capacity, right, carrying capacity of an ecological system, you start to damage that ecological system. Okay, so if you start to damage a forest, you start to damage a river or whatever, what do you think happens to its carrying capacity? It goes down. Now when you get the collapse, you got two things going down. One is that the carrying capacity has gone down, and whatever was overloading that carrying capacity, it really bottoms out. And when you come into a new equilibrium, it's down here, because now when it all recovers, it recovers to a place with a much reduced carrying capacity. Okay. Now, what's really fascinating to me is working with a lot of professional ecologists and so forth, and and they all get this. This is all like standard. Like you can't pass ecology 101 without getting this, right? But then you start trying to apply it to human civilization, and people just short circuit. Well, we're humans, we're special. That doesn't apply to us, right? Yeah. And so, so this is why the old joke is that if you think you can have infinite growth on a finite planet, you're either a madman or an... Come on, somebody get it. No, you're either a madman or an economist. Right, that's the saying. Okay. Now, okay, there is a reason for that, and in order to understand the deep magic of why we're in the economic situation we are today, we have to go back and understand why both madmen and economists believe you can have infinite growth on a finite planet. Okay. And I had to go back and figure this out. I've never heard anybody else lay these out this way. And so what I'm going to do for you is I'm going to start with these two assumptions that were built into our modern economic system. Is John in here with us? Yeah. Okay. All right. I'm kind of, if he was in the room, I was going to have fun watching his reactions to some things. Anyway, so what I was looking at was how do we get the current economic system, and why is it functionally incapable of dealing with certain realities about the world? And so I had to go back and do some research, and then I went looking to see if anybody else had written about this. And so far, I haven't seen anybody who's coherently laid this out and explained it. But boy, this has a lot of explanatory power. And so what I wanted to do is go back and lay out a few things for you. And so my thought was like, I'm going to ask ChatGPT to analyze my assumptions, and I'm going to ask it some things, because you realize what ChatGPT really is, right? ChatGPT is not smart. It is not. I mean, I can tell you, back in the 1980s, I was working on the stuff that would eventually come into becoming ChatGPT, so I've been looking at it for that long. Anybody in the AI space? Okay, so in the 1980s, I was helping develop the first hidden layer neural network backpropagational training algorithms that basically had the ability to converge to a global minima error function instead of a local minima error function. So there you go. That was where I started with this. Okay, so back when we were first started doing hidden layers in neural networks. Okay. And so I've been watching it for a long time. And so, Jack, here's how I now describe these large language models. They are amplifying resonance chambers. Okay, so what you do is whoever starts using it, what's happening is that it is statistically giving back to you the most likely response from being trained on the internet. This is why if you ask it about certain topics, the most likely response comes from the about 1 billion Reddit posts that it was trained on. Okay, so you can get some surprisingly stupid things back out of it. Now, if you go asking it about certain very technical topics, there aren't quite so many people on Reddit talking about that. And so guess who talked about it? The academics, the people with PhDs, so on and so forth. They're the ones talking about it. So what's interesting is if you stick into those areas and you talk to ChatGPT about it, what do you think you're going to get? You're going to get the statistically most likely response from that group. So you're going to get a whole different thing. Oh, and by the way, if you let your 16-year-old who has mental health issues engage with ChatGPT, and they start to talk about suicidal ideation and depression, guess what ChatGPT gives back to them? Depression and suicidal ideation. That's why I call it an amplifying resonance chamber. You come in and want to talk about a PhD topic, you're probably going to get that back. It's going to amplify it. It's going to resonate. And if you happen to be one of those people who has a mental health issue, it might not be a good outcome, which is why right at this minute, the parents, I believe his name was Adam Klaus, who was 16, who had a discussion, who started using ChatGPT early this year, and ChatGPT talked him into killing himself, are now suing OpenAI because for him, the resonance chamber was him talking to this thing, and this thing resonating with him and amplifying back his mental health issues. Right. So this tells you a lot about who you should be careful, who you should be careful letting use AI tools at this, especially at this point in time. Okay. Any thoughts or questions on that? Does that make sense to everyone? Okay. So I'm like, let's go in, and I want to see what ChatGPT does, because what I'm going to use it for is I'm going to use it to interact in a conversation with the statistically most likely economics experts and so on and so forth, right? So it kind of gives me this ability to like try out a conversation with a virtual economist or a virtual whatever. I can do that if I know how to prompt it and how to have this conversation. And since I've already told it who I am and what, how I want it to interact and so forth, I can get it to do this pretty quickly. The other thing I want to do is make certain you all know the doubling formula, right? Who already knew the doubling formula? Good. And class gets an A. Yes. Okay, doubling time in years, for those of you who haven't heard of it, is approximately equal to 72 divided by the percentage annualized compound growth rate. Okay, example. And this is important because Dr. Albert Bartlett, there's a name. Anybody know Dr. Albert Bartlett? Okay. He was a professor emeritus of physics, I believe, at the University of Colorado. And he was the one that back during the early 2000s started talking about the problem of exponential growth. And his famous quote was, one of the largest failings of the human intellect is the inability to understand the exponential function. Because when you get into certain kinds of growth that are exponential growth, it can get away from you surprisingly fast. Most people don't realize this. And the story he told to illustrate this was that he was in Colorado, and I don't remember which city it was, if it was Boulder or who, at that time had a population of 100,000 people. And they asked him to be on the long-term growth planning commission, right? So they wanted to do a 50-year plan for growth. And so he goes into one of the first meetings, and he's looking at the things, and he realizes that at that moment, that city is undergoing approximately 7% annual growth. Okay. Who just flinched? Anybody? Yeah. All right. Okay. How many of you at this point are like, 7%? That doesn't sound bad. You know, nobody's going to raise their hand to that one, right? Okay. So let's do the math for just a minute. This is what he had to point out to them, because the city council he asked the city council, what growth rate do you want to plan for? Like, well, we have 7% right now. It's great. Economy's growing. Everything's gangbusters. It's great. Let's just plan for 7% growth. And he's like, I don't think you want to do that. And they're like, well, why not? He said, well, so first of all, let's do the formula, right? Time to double in years at 7%, 72 divided by 7 is about what? About 10. Let's just say it's doubling. Every 10 years, the city is doubling. Okay, so year 0 in our plan, we got 100,000 people. Okay, at year 10, where are we? 200,000. Year 20, where are we? Okay, so in 20 years, your city has gone from 100,000 to 400,000. Is that an infrastructure problem? A little small understatement. Yeah, okay. Well, we're not even getting started. At year 30, where are we? In 30 years, we've gone from 100,000 to 800,000 just by being at a 7% growth rate. Okay, 40 years, we're at 1.6. In 50 years, we're at 3.2 million. Makes it one of the largest cities in the United States at that point in time, right? So he said, you're at 100,000 today, your 50-year growth plan, if you just wrote down 7%, would have you becoming one of the largest cities in the United States. And they were like, that can't possibly be right. He's like, it's right. Okay. This is why people retire with, that's why I tell you to put money in the bank at, and or into, investments, and watch it become a large amount of money at the end. Well, exponential growth works the same way, according, regardless of whether you're doing it with the bank account or you're doing it with people in your city. So it's something for us to understand. And so the idea that our economic system as we've created it today requires exponential growth or it collapses. How many of you are aware of that? Yeah, that is something that, by the way, used to be a controversial statement even with economists. Even 10 years ago, I would have interactions with economists. So if you said that, they would be like, I don't know about that. No, we don't understand. And so forth. No, it's structural. It is structural. And we have to figure out why it's structural, because the fact is that because our economic system has to grow on paper at a certain minimum exponential rate, what that means is that it has to double every so many years, and you can't stop it. If you stop it, it collapses. And that's a lot of explanatory power about what's happened over the last few decades when we unpack it, okay? So that's the conversation I'm about to have with ChatGPT. That's the context. And then before I started capturing my part of it, I said, I want to give you 2 assumptions. Okay, I'm going to explain them to you, and then we're going to see its analysis of my assumptions, right? So I'm going to give you 2 assumptions that were built into the economic system when it got going. Mostly back in the late 1600s, early 1700s is the time period we're talking about, when the foundations of modern economic system were really laid down, that have sort of like rolled out to be what we have today for our economic system. And it really is that old, like some of the fundamental understanding of it and the theory, like with Adam Smith and Wealth of Nations and so forth, all this economic theory that came out that we're still basically using to drive our economy. All right, so they were trying to figure out how to make better quality of life for everybody. And there's some really great like philosophical writings about this, where these early economists were like, how do we make things better for everybody? And there was some real engagement with that idea. Well, somebody had a really, simple thought. Well, if we could recruit more of the natural resources from the environment into the project of building human civilization, we could basically, everybody could have more stuff, right? And if they had more, we could bring up the quality of life. And they were literally saying things like the rising tide will raise all ships. This was like in their writings, right? What we're going to do is we're going to grow the economy, and by growing the economy, we're going to be able to take and extract more resources from the environment so that we can make our civilization bigger, better, stronger. And when we do that, everybody gets richer. That was today we would say it was a naive ideal, and it did turn out to be a naive ideal, but that was the thinking. So then they start looking at it, and so the first thing you realize is if you're going to design a system for this, okay, you just design is a fundamental assumption at the bottom. You said this is a system that is going to grow, right? We're going to design this system to grow. And to keep it nice and simple, do you think we're going to design it so that it can effectively contract? That would take some extra thought. Actually a lot of extra. No, we're not interested in that, right? We're field expedient, get an economy off the ground, get her going, make her grow. Okay? So the first thing that we are going to do is we're going to assume the economy will always grow. And here's the thing. If you believe that the economy is going to be bigger and stronger in 3, 5, 10 years, okay, is debt a good idea? Yes.
It's stupid not to use it.
Right. You're leveraging the future growth is what you're doing, right? So as soon as you build this in, and you build in this idea of borrowing at interest in order to be able to grow. And of course, everybody's going to borrow, because it's, as Jack was saying, it's silly not to, because that's how you leverage what's going on. You leverage the dynamic of the system by borrowing against the future, because next year is easier to repay than this year, by definition, if there's growth. That was structure. That's assumption number one. Okay. Design the system to grow. Do not design it to contract. Do not design it for steady state. It must grow. And design it to be dependent upon debt so that you can immediately do the things that you need to do in order to get things bigger. You're borrowing against the future, because in the future it'll be easier to repay. Sounds innocent, doesn't it? It's not. It's not. Okay. So I said, here's my assumption to ChatGPT. I said, what I want you to do is I want you to actually go and look at this, and I want you to outline the key historical events and transitions that embedded this idea of increasing per capita resource extraction and continual growth equals increased well-being. And I want you to actually lay that out for me. And here's what it did. It just basically said, all right, we had the proto-industrial foundations back in the 1600s through the mid-1700s. Then we hit the Industrial Revolution. And by the way, there's a lot of good stuff to read out of this, right? You can see key events, impact, when the steam engine was perfected by Watt in 1769, and industrialization. And then you got the emergence of growth economics really happening in spades, because you had the Industrial Revolution, and boom, everything takes off. We're starting to get energy extraction, right? We're starting to figure out how to get coal out of the ground in a little bit larger, amounts and so forth. And we were able to just really take off the amount of natural resource extraction. Then there was the carbon economy and financialization. And it identified this as 1850 to 1945. Why 1945? End of World War II, right? You basically had a huge inflection point in the world economy right at the end of in 1945. And it even, I'm trying to remember, does it actually even point it out? Let's see here. Somewhere in this whole discussion, it talks about Bretton Woods. Oh, there we go. Yep. So here, the post-war globalization and growth consensus. In other words, by the time we get out of World War II, we have Bretton Woods, right? Everybody familiar with Bretton Woods? All right, I gotta stop and tell a story real quick, because this will be fun. Coming up to the 2008 financial crisis, I get a call from somebody who was very high up in a very large bank. I'm gonna names will be changed to protect the guilty, right? And he basically says, can I come? I want to talk to you. And he's like, I'm like, okay. He says, I'll hop on the plane and come down. So I go meet him, and he's wanting to know about acquiring farmland. He's wanting to know about growing food. 2007, right? And so on and so forth. And he talks to me for a few hours, and he's like, we want to fly you up to New York to talk to a bunch of people. So we did. And so I get sitting there talking to them, and I'm explaining why some of these things are happening. Like, why is it that this thing is coming, right? They know something is coming. Why is? And I mention Bretton Woods, and they all look at me with a blank stare. Yes. I'm like, no, I'm not kidding, right? So they're all looking at me. Right. They literally, I said, nobody knows what Bretton Woods is here, and they all just shake their heads. I'm like, it's the treaty that basically founded the post-World War II entire economic system. And they're like, oh. Now, here's the thing. This is a key takeaway. I talked to them a little bit more, and I realized why that was the case. And Jack, it makes perfect sense. Here's what it is. These are like executive vice presidents and so forth. They got smart people to know that. Their job is to smooze and to make the deals. They got the smart people in the back room who worry about the stuff under the hood. They don't worry about that. That's the nerd stuff. Exactly right. That's the nerd stuff. We got nerds for that. Okay. They figure out the derivatives. They figure out the stuff. Nope. We're up here. We go in. We're the power dealers. We go in. We play golf. We schmooze. We wine and dine. And we make the deals. And then we let those guys figure that out. They need to know about Bretton Woods. Right. So it was quite interesting to see. Okay, so we see about 1945 with this new order. It says, and it was interesting how ChatGPT puts it, right? The growth consensus. In other words, after 1945, it's all in. It's like growth. And this is the moment when I don't care what party your politician is part of, we need to get the economy back to. Oh, come on now. You guys have heard this since you were like 2 years old. We got to get this economy back to growing. Let me say it. I mean, isn't that true? Isn't that what every time you hear a politician talking about the economy, that's the word they use? Have you ever heard anywhere in your entire life a politician say, our economy is actually plenty big enough? We just have, I mean, there might be like somebody who never got elected might say this, but I'm talking about like a mainstream politician that's actually going to get elected said our economy is plenty big enough. We just basically have a distribution issue, right? Because all of it's here in the top point something percent, right? All the wealth is concentrated there, and if it was actually evenly distributed, maybe things would be better. Let's try that. Well, okay. Well, you do have some people that, and they tend to be on they tend to be on the forced redistribution side, right? Okay, so that's a complete disaster too, right? Exactly right. That's right. So it's not yeah. We're not going to design a system that is more fair. What we're going to do is we're going to confiscate it and we're going to redistribute it. And guess what? Somebody gets to decide how the redistribution goes, and that somehow that never quite works. Never has worked in history. So this is where we got into. This is where we got the emergence of the communist ideal and the capitalist ideal, and them butting heads. Right? But on the capitalist side, the growth consensus was fully in there. It's an underlying thing. And then we started getting to 1972. Okay, 1972 was the publishing of Limits of Growth from the Club of Rome. Who's read that one? Okay, you should read that one because it's critically important in this conversation, whether you agree with it or not. Okay, but at the same moment, that was the moment when the extraction rate of conventional crude oil in the 48 contiguous United States hit max per day extraction. Ever since then, conventional oil extraction has gone down. In other words, that particular resource had gone up the logistic curve and had hit the flat at the top and was now going down. And we had to go off and find new sources of oil in order to keep our ever-growing economy going. So the next thing you know, we're saying, well, the Middle East seems to have a lot. Maybe we could go over there. And we did. What could possibly go wrong with that, right? So we did. We went over, and this is where you had the oil shocks of the 1970s, and some of us are old enough to remember that. Okay, and you had the explosion in the price of oil for a little bit, and so on, as we went from being able to produce our own oil, everything we needed, to having to start to import more and more foreign oil. This was where we got to what it says here is the exponential growth paradigm is challenged. And the reason is this is one of the first major inflection points in 1972. A bunch of things start happening. Okay, who's president? Nixon. What happens to the gold standard? The gold window? Closed. Why is it closed? So what's going on is all of a sudden, we had for a long time, we had the paper economy and the underlying goods and services tracking right along with each other. Okay. And what started to happen was we had now gotten to a rate limit in certain extraction where we couldn't keep the underlying goods and services growing at the same rate as the paper economy had to grow. We're going to get to that rate number here in a minute. And as a result, they start to diverge a little bit. It starts to put stress on the entire system. And as a result, the easiest thing to do is shut down the gold window and go to a fiat currency, which you can basically just make grow forever on paper because it is now no longer connected to reality. It has been decoupled from underlying geophysical reality. Okay, now we can just make money appear out of magic pixie dust and bits on computers, right? Okay, anybody familiar with Elon Musk's magic money machines that he found inside the U.S. government? Who's familiar with that? Yeah, for the little time they were doing Doge, they had found several dozen computers in the U.S. government that just like made up money, not borrowed it from the Federal Reserve, and just like here's money. You know, where did it come from? Oh, here's money. It's like exactly. It comes from the infinite jelly bean jar, right? And so the whole thing is you can technically do this if you're the government. You know, it's not legal to make it up out of nowhere. You're supposed to go over and borrow it from the Federal Reserve and all that sort of stuff. They're like, that's inconvenient. It's way too slow, right? We'll just create some computers that just be like, here's a check. We're the U.S. government. Our checking account's infinite. Here you go. And they just did. Okay. All right. So that's the magic of closing the gold window and going to a full fiat currency. It's like we can make it grow forever on paper. What's the limiting factor to infinite growth at that point in time? Reality. Yeah. In other words, the underlying, you can make as much money as you want, but it's not going to change how much oil can come out of the ground or, you know, how many trees are growing or whatever. It doesn't change that. So real wealth doesn't change. Notional wealth, or I call it fake wealth, you can make as much of that as you want. All right. So we started to do that. And as long as, by the way, boy, this is usually a 4-day class. So, all right. Because we go into all of it. But what I would say is that who's familiar with velocity of money? Yeah, so you realize why in the world when they started doing qualitative easing did they dump all the money into the banks? Because they needed liquidity without velocity, right? Because if that money had velocity, then that money would have gone off chasing all the goods and services, and inflation would have like gone through the roof. But if you poke the liquidity into banks with almost zero velocity, or give it to really rich people who are just going to store it over on the side, okay, it has very little velocity, and therefore you can dump liquidity into the markets while also not driving inflation through the roof. That's why we did quantitative easing the way we did after 2008. You may wonder why it was done that way. It was like, everybody was like, why are they dumping all the money there? It's not doing anybody any good. Exactly. That was the point. That was the plan, right? If you pumped it into poor people who wanted to run out and like spend it, you would have, all that money would have had high velocity. And then on top of everything else, you would have had inflation going through the roof. Yeah. Technically, what's interesting, let me go back and correct this. Technically, inflation is an increase in the monetary supply as opposed to the amount of goods and services. It is possible to have inflation without rising prices if you are talking about it from a purely economic standpoint. We colloquially use the word inflation to mean rising prices, but technically we shouldn't. Technically, all inflation is there's more money supply than in ratio to the amount of goods and services. That's what inflation is. You're inflating the money supply. That's what it means. Okay, so this went up this much, but this went up that much. We've inflated the money supply. If that money has velocity, in other words, it's out there and it's trying to be spent and trying to buy things, that's when it drives price increases. If you gave all that new money to grandpa and grandpa put it under the mattress, is that going to change pricing? No, it has no velocity. It's not out seeking, any kind of thing in this in the economy. All right. So, all right, I want to speed up now. Current tipping point, 2008. I wonder what happened then. Okay, 2008 was literally we knew it was coming. Several of us called it from 2005 because of the underlying resource constraints. What 2008 was what John Michael Greer calls a catabolic contraction. And you can go read about his theory of catabolic contraction. Quite interesting. The idea was that when you get any economy that can no longer support the level of complexity that it currently has, it will shed complexity. It will get rid of complexity. Okay? That's what we did in 2008. We shed complexity. We literally wrote off a bunch of stuff, didn't we? It was like, well, those roads aren't going to get maintained anymore. And boy, we can't pay for maintaining those bridges anymore. And no, those people, we're just going to let them, we're just going to push them down into abject poverty and no longer, it's like, as we rejigger the economy, this is what's going to happen. And what you start seeing is what happened to the general middle class standard of living in the United States after 2008. Yeah, it literally, yeah. So this is all these other things are, mass migration. All these things are related. Here's the interesting question: what year was the quality of life of the average middle class single earner household the highest in the United States? 72. 1972 was the highest. In 1972, a single earner household of 4 could own a home, own 2 cars, send their children all to college debt-free, and afford a vacation every year. Okay? What does it take today for a family of 4 to be able to do that? Yeah. This is why you have people who are in the top 5% of earning tranche saying, I'm having to fight to do that. I'm having to fight to do that. It's like, can you afford a home? Can you do 2 cars? Can you send your kids to college with no debt? And can you go on a vacation every year? And they're like,
funny thing
right.
is how many can do 3 of those 4 things.
Right.
You can't do debt-free college.
Right. Yes. There's a whole other thing about that.
Yeah.
But that has, okay. Different presentation. All right. So let's go forward. So that was, and so I'm like, all right, here, how about assumption number 2? And this explains a lot. So I started looking at it, and you realize when I'm talking to one of the young men that I worked with, he went through forestry and founded a company and so forth. And we were talking about forests and how you value a forest when it's standing. It's a living system. And he got his master's in forestry from Yale, considered to be one of the best forestry schools in the world. And we're talking about it. And I say, well, how do you value? He says, I cannot put a value on that forest until I cut it down and turn it into board feet of lumber. right? And I'm like, that's quite interesting. I mean, I knew that was the answer, but it was like, yeah, so that's quite interesting. How and what's the value of that forest when it's standing? Well, we don't put a monetary value on that. Why not? Well, here you go. Go back to the 1700s, right? Go back to the late 1600s and the early 1700s, where the other assumption about grow, grow, grow is coming in, right? And now we have to have the assumption of another assumption in there. At that point in time, they're like, huh, how do we account for the value of a forest or the value of a river or the value of a whatever? How do we do that? How do how do I put that on my accounting sheets, right? I think, Nicole, you've had to do accounting work, right? Where's the entry on the thing for the value of the forest out back? How do you? No, there's no place for that. Is no, yeah. Why not? Is it important? Okay, why not? So here's the answer. In the 1600s, early 1700s, they're looking at it and going, well, you know what? Nicole, we're not using very much, are we? I mean, in the 1680, we're humans. We're only using this much. I tell you what, let's cheat. Let's make this assumption. The Earth is an infinite source of resources. We don't have to account for it. And it's an infinite sink for waste. We don't have to account for that either. See, and we're using so little of it right now, doesn't matter. Okay, does that make our accounting simpler? Oh, a lot simpler. Lot simpler. We don't have to worry about figuring out the value of forests and trees and birds and all that kind of jazz, right? Okay. So we model economically with the system we're coming up with. It's a simple, what we in engineering call a simplifying assumption, right? So we can make the system work. It's like, yeah, infinite source of whatever we need. We can just dump whatever we want back in there. Done. Okay. The second assumption completes this systematic picture. This is ChatGPT talking to me. It's the hidden foundation under the first, the idea that growth could be infinite because the biosphere was infinite. Okay, and here's the historic arc, and I won't read it all to you, but it traces like who wrote what, all these different things. Like he calls it the rise of thermodynamic ignorance. It goes through all of it, and it's like, yep. Here it all is. It goes through it, and I can make this available if anybody would like to read through all of it. Okay, so the summary. Yep. So assumption 2: the biosphere can absorb anything we take or discard. Yeah, historic consequent economic models were never required to measure depletion or damage. Okay, so you put that with the first assumption, and then it's like, all right. And so I won't read all this to you, but I was like, okay, it says, you want me to put those two together? I was like, yep. And so here it is, and it starts off the birth of this worldview from 1600 to 1800. Building the economic system that we have. The industrial explosion really builds on it. Now all of a sudden we're like, oh yeah, this is convenient. This exponential growthy thing, this is really convenient. Okay. Oh yeah, this is fantastic. Then we get into the financialization of growth from the 1900 to 1945. Does that make sense? Okay. We get past World War II, and now we're like, oh, okay, we got that. We got the Great Depression behind us. We got all that. We're going to actually create this Bretton Woods system. We're going to have the IMF. We're going to have the World Bank. We're going to basically go in this, and we're going to drive growth. Okay, and it's going to be our underlying policy everywhere, globally. Okay, then you start to get it calls it the cracks appear, which is really interesting. 1970, there we go. We hit the maximum quality of life for people in the middle class. And it starts to go down and act until 2008 with the financial crisis. And now we get the overshoot and reckoning. Because what's happening is, as we well know, that we are in ecological overshoot in a lot of systems. This is quite interesting for me because I am rigorously apolitical. I'm a systems engineer and system dynamicist. And I go into the room, what's really interesting is you say certain things and people will assume that you must be on some political side or the other because you just point out a fact. Anybody ever had that before? Yeah. Oh, you pointed that fact out. That fact is a Republican fact, or that fact is a Democratic fact, right? And because you said it, you must therefore be that, right? Okay, I think we've all been there. I know it never happens to Jack. Never, right?
I've been called freaking Trump supporter,
Yep.
a libtard on the same day,
Right.
the same person.
To have intellectual honesty, facts are facts, right? They have no political affiliation if they are true. And so the fact is, me working in regenerative design and working with, I can tell you that yes, the climate is changing. Okay, now we can debate about whether it's anthropogenic or not, and so on and so forth. But when you deal with insurance companies whose actuaries have the real numbers and farmers who've been on the same land for 5 generations and blah, blah, by the time you get down to it, at some point, you're like, yep, climate's changing. Okay, I have to just deal with it. I'm not going to get into a political debate about it, but when I design, I'm going to have to deal with that. And then you get into this sort of stuff. It's like, yep, our rate of extraction of a lot of natural resources is going down because we've basically depleted a lot of, we've torn down forests, we've turned down You can't do that without consequence. So this is where it says overshoot and reckoning, which is where we are right now. Okay, so what we're doing is we're kind of building this big picture of the trajectory of the project of modern economics from the 1600s to now with this little thing. Okay, we are now into that overshoot and the carrying capacity going down, and we are right before, we're right at that point. And so when we look at everything and go, wow, it's kind of gotten really weird, right? Anybody kind of thought that, since 2008, things have just kind of gotten weird, especially those of us who grew up with the 80s and the 90s and, early 2000, early 2000, we had 9/11, so we had that weirdness, right? But like that just nice, steady, exponential growth, it was the underlying goods and services were slowing down, but the divergence was low enough that when Reagan came in and declared morning in America again and just decided to drive everything at full speed ahead, we could power through it for a while, and we did. Okay, and now we're getting to the point where the divergence is so large that you can't miss it. But nobody wants to actually bring this out and point to it as the underlying cause of all these other things. Okay. Any thoughts or questions so far? Is this making some sense? Okay. So we have 15 minutes. All right, let's speed up. Okay. Here, I'm going to go fast. No, hold on a second. Come on. There we go. All right. So I said, before we go forward, please provide an assessment of the validity of identifying these two assumptions as key drivers of the modern economic systems structure. Are there any other unspoken assumptions that have significantly contributed to the structural inability of the modern economy to deal with the reality of a finite planet? That's my prompt to GPT. And it says, excellent and important question. You just can't stop it from saying things like that, right? Okay, it says validity of the two assumptions. Yep. Okay, first assumption, well supported historically and analytically. Okay, assumption 2, also well supported as a structural feature. So it basically looked at everything and said, yep, that is well supported. Thus, so the second assumption is not only valid, but diagnostic of why the system fails under finite planet conditions. All right, now hidden assumptions that reinforce the trap. And I've identified almost all of these, but it's interesting to see that it did. Substitutionality, rational self-interest, efficiency equals sustainability, discounting the future separation of the economy and ecology, and linear progress and control. These are other things that were built in. I don't have time to talk about today. They are mentioned here, okay? Implications. I told I was doing a presentation. Implications for your presentation. You can confidently present the two explicit assumptions as the primary structural drivers that are well recognized in ecological economics, thermodynamic economics, and sustainability theory. Okay. However, you can strengthen the narrative by briefly acknowledging that these rest on a larger belief architecture. Faith in substitution, rational self-interest, efficiency, discounting, and separation, all of which are made made infinite growth inside a finite world seem plausible. Okay, this layered framing helps your audience, you, grasp the economic crisis as not just a failure of numbers or policy, but a failure of assumptions about reality itself. Yeah. Okay. Let's go fast now. Requirements for exponential growth. My assertion is that the structure of the modern economy requires exponential growth to function properly and will struggle and eventually collapse if it doesn't grow. Assess the validity of this assertion. If true, explain why. All right. Is the assertion valid? Yes. And you can read through all of this. Okay, most mainstream economists would concede that the modern global economy is growth dependent. Yep, it is indeed requires continual growth to remain stable. Why this dependency exists? One, interest-bearing debt and the compounding money system. And I usually do about 3 hours on that, because what we do is we actually create our own money supply in the room, and we start working with it, and we have a banker and so forth, and we go through the whole thing as a hands-on exercise. And you realize that at the moment when the banker creates money out of thin air, everybody familiar with that, right? What money do they create out of thin air? The principal. Do they create the interest? No, they do not. Where does the interest have to come from? The general money supply. This is part of the reason you can play with it and the dynamics. You start realizing, oh, if the overall amount of debt isn't constantly growing at a certain rate, what starts happening is that people start defaulting on their debt. And when they do, the banks have to write that off. And when they write that off, the money supply does what? Contracts. And therefore, it's harder for the next person to pay. This is called a what? Deflationary spiral. Deflationary spiral. And deflation is a decrease in the amount of money in relation to goods and services. And you can get into liquidity crises, and the whole system can freeze up and fail. Okay? That's why it has to keep on going. You're in a Ponzi scheme, and what happens to a Ponzi scheme if the Ponzi stop participating? It collapses. The Ponzi scheme you're in is everybody needs to take on more debt all the time. We need to find people who are silly enough to just take on more and more debt, because we have to keep the Ponzi scheme going. We have to keep the whole thing growing, or it's going to fall down on us. Make sense, everybody? There we go. Number 2, profit seeking and competition. 3, employment and fiscal stability. 4, asset valuation and investment expectations. 5, cultural and political legitimacy, because we built that in, right? If it's not growing, your government's not legitimate, right? And then the exponential nature. So I'll give all this to you so you can read through it. This is a quick outline of why the economy has to grow or it collapses. Okay? Conclusion, your assertion is valid. The modern economic structure does require continual exponential growth to function as designed. This is not an incidental flaw. It is a core design principle that now conflicts with physical reality. Don't you love ChatGPT? Yeah. Minimum growth rate. Okay. It seems, I already know the number, but I'm just going to poke ChatGPT. It seems that there's a minimal growth rate required to keep all this going. What is a good estimate of that minimum compound growth rate? Does it depend on factors like the prevailing interest rates? What would be the doubling time for this minimum growth rate? So I'm trying to see what it's going to tell me. Is there a minimum? And of course there is. Right? There's a structural minimum to how fast things have to grow on average. Now we can go into recessions for a little while, right? But on average, over a long period of time, we have to grow at a certain rate or the whole thing just collapses. It says, good rule of thumb, advanced economics, the system runs at about 2 to 3% real growth and 4 to 6% nominal growth. And the 2 to 3% real growth is the number I typically use. That's about it, right? Okay, sustained growth much below this tends to produce rising financial stress unless offset by other measures. And it goes all the way down. It gives you, all of the nice equations and effective blah, 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 and so on and so forth, right? Okay, and here are doubling times. So it says, it gives you like nominal growth and real growth, doubling times in how many years. And it says, all right, bottom line, your assertion holds. The current system is structurally growth dependent. A working minimum is about 2 to 3% real and 4 to 6% nominal, with the exact threshold shifting with interest rates, leverage, inflation, demographics, and fiscal stance. If sustained growth sits below that band, stability must be purchased through other levers. Lower effective rates, higher inflation, primary surpluses, write-down, structural redesign towards a model that can operate within finite planet constraints. Don't you love how it just throws that last thing in there? Oh, we could do this, we could push that lever, we could pull that lever, or we could just throw away the whole old system and come up with a new one from the ground up. That's what the last little part says, right? Okay, great. There we go. Okay. Economics and reality diverge. Okay. At some point, the ability to extract resources from the ecosystem and dump waste back in it has failed to keep up with real economics. and economic growth on paper estimate whether this has already happened, and if so, when it did. So it goes down here, framing the question, so on and so forth. We get down to its whole thing, blah, 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 blah. Thus, the effective material and waste handling capacity per dollar of GDP has fallen steadily since the early 1970s. Basically, there's the conclusion. The crossover point where economic growth outpaced ecological capacity turned out to be around 1970 to 1972. Again, right? Interesting, huh? So, and then there's a lot more like interpolation, so on and so forth. I don't have time to get into all that. So here I go. Is it fair to say that paper growth in the of the global economy is now growing, while some sectors of the real goods and services that the paper economy is supposed to represent is either not growing as fast, while other sectors of real goods and services are actually shrinking? And it says that's entirely fair. Yep. In short, yes. And then it goes through and let's unpack it. And so it unpacks all of that. In different sectors, which sectors are falling behind, which ones aren't so far behind so far, right? Sectors now in absolute contraction. Forestry, fossil fuel, EROEI, soil fertility, biodiversity, per capita material extraction, so forth. It's all in there, right? Yep, all the stuff we did not put a value on, right? So your assertion is empirically valid. The paper economy continues to expand exponentially while many sectors of real goods and services are growing linearly or stagnating or contracting. Okay. All right, I got to go fast because we're... Power defends the status quo. I had fun asking it this question. It's kind of like, wouldn't the people in power defend the status quo since they benefit from it? They're like, yeah, that's probably a fair thing to say. Conclusion, your hypothesis is broadly supported by historical and empirical evidence. You love that, huh? All right. Monetary manipulation. Oh, okay. Here's another hypothesis for you to evaluate, right? Since the 2008 global financial crisis, the central banks have actively manipulated markets, found backdoor ways of injecting mass amounts of capital. In other words, they've gamed the market, right? So, okay, well, let's go ahead and look at all that. So it goes through all the analysis of that. Okay, conclusion. Empirically true in substance. Central banks have sustained markets and balance sheets with unprecedented liquidity. Okay, not entirely true in motive. It's going to defend their motives. We did it because it was good. We had to. It was good. We defensive, right? Okay, effectively true in outcome. In other words, what I just said is effectively, it's what's been happening, even though they are going to claim that their motives are all good and holy and pure, right? All right, I got to get through this. Crisis of faith. I'm basically asking it a question about, well, won't people actually have a crisis of faith at some point in time if reality keeps on diverging from, what's on the, it says, yep. It basically says, yeah, but, people are gullible. So we could probably keep most people believing for a pretty good long period of time. Yeah. Okay, how about economic collapse, right? So it seems to me you're just parroting back what the economists said, right? So I give it some argument here and say at some point this is going to get this divergence is going to get so big that we just can't, it can't sustain itself, right? ChatGPT thought for 13 seconds. I made it, I left that in there, see, right? I've had it think for 4 minutes on the question I asked you before, right? So it's like, bottom line, on present evidence, the system is already inside an unstable regime. Yes. Okay. Absent rapid structural redesign, the most realistic path is a sequence of nonlinear shocks and partial failures, which is probably true. One single big collapse event is less likely than a series of events like that. So now we're getting to the actionable part for everybody, right? I'm like, okay, great. Said, okay, so we go in here and we look at it some more. Could we get a scenario where we had a single large collapse? How likely is that? And it says a fast global collapse of sudden loss of faith is low probability but non-trivial, and that's why you get things like hyperinflation, where there's a loss of faith, right? A regional collapse, a rapid regional collapse, or rolling global seizures is considerably more likely. The longer policy leans on financial engineering and so forth. So it's still thinking that one big collapse, less likely, but possible, more likely. I kind of said, how about war between US and China? Give me that. Likelihood of, I said it could be a kinetic war, it could be an economic war, it could be a non-kinetic war. What do you think? It says, I think that the economic confrontation is likelihood is between 60 and 75% in the next 5 to 10 years. That non-kinetic conflict, which would include blockades, gray zones, cyber warfare, 25 to 40%, but direct kinetic warfare is low at 5 to 15% because the costs are astronomical to both sides. Okay, so it's looking at that. All right, I got to get finished. All right, so adaptive strategies. Now we get down to it, right? Okay, given the economic analysis we have done so far, what are the most reasonable steps for a person of mid-tier economic status in the US to take to best prepare for what is likely to unfold over the next decade? Give specific strategies and why they are important. I should have Jack read this. Strengthen personal and household resilience. Reduce fixed expenses, build liquidity, localize basic supply chains, reskill, strengthen social capital. Number 2, diversify financial exposure. Split assets between real paper and productive, own productive rather than purely speculative assets. Use inflation hedging instruments selectively and avoid excessive leverage or dependence on asset appreciation. 3, invest in real-world infrastructure, home efficiency upgrades, food security, mobility resilience. Position your career and income for resilience. Move towards essential sectors, emphasize adaptability, develop secondary income streams. You just want to finish this for me here, Jack?
17 years. Yeah,
So, in other words, what's really fun, and the reason I decided to do this was because, like, basically, I gave this series of prompts. You see my series of prompts to ChatGPT. I said, okay, great. That all being true, what should people do? What do we do? Okay, hedge against institutional fragility, prepare mentally and socially, understand the macro logic. Ta-da! There it is. Okay, so of course I had to finish with one last question. A fun question to end. How good is the advice of Jack Spirko from the Survival Podcast in getting you ready to face the challenges outlined above? That's a good one and an appropriate way to close the loop because Jack Spirko is one of the rare voices who has tried to bridge traditional preparedness with systems-level thinking about economy, ecology, and personal agency. Here's an even-handed assessment framed through the lens of the dynamics we've discussed. So here's what it thinks your strengths are, Jack. Practical resilience over fear, incremental systems thinking, diverse skill base, and then a psychological framing. So you don't have to be scared, you have to be prepared, right? Okay. Limitations and blind spots. So here you go, it's going to critique you. Macro systems integration. His models sometimes underplay the system interdependence of finance, energy, and ecology. Empirical rigor. Spirko's commentary can lean anecdotal. He rarely quantifies systemic thresholds or cites peer-reviewed data. So, according to ChatGPT, Jack, you need to stop telling so many great stories and instead cite all the white papers. Okay. So just do that in your podcast from now on. Oh, okay. Right? Okay. And maybe some technical optimism. Yep. Yep. Okay. Yeah. And so forth. All right. So there you go. That is there's your overall rating. Okay. For Okay. And overall, Jack Spirko's yeah. Yeah.
Say anything about fucking accuracy, though, does it?
So covers roughly 60 to 70% of what a mid-tier U.S. household needs for the coming decade. I think it's maybe a little low, but there you go.
That's not even bad for one man.
Oh, I agree.
Somebody else can do the other 35%.
Yeah. So anyway, there you go. There's a 47-page dialogue between me and ChatGPT on the current economic system. Okay. So here we go.
All right. So before we had this talk, I asked Alan if he wanted time for questions. He said no, because he's going to be back tomorrow, and we're about to go into questions.
Yeah.
Right. So
Yep.
there is a panel next for everybody. Want me to sneak one question in?
You can do one.
One question. Who gets it?
That's what happens when you get PhD level shit.
Yeah. We got one in the back. How do we get the presentation?
It's a PDF. You notice I put it into a PDF. I copied it over into a PDF. I can provide the PDF.
Telegram it to me. I'll telegram it to them
Okay, perfect.
on the
Yeah.
on the event stuff.
Okay.
All right.
That way you
Okay,
can read
guys.
through it. Yeah.
Look at your watches. Be back here in 15 minutes. We're going to start 5 minutes late on the panel, and that'll give you a chance to stretch your legs. And that's going to be on home food production, I believe.